Hello, welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. So, a few videos ago, we spent quite a lot of time looking at SAP Ui5 consumption, particularly in the HANA world, where we're often consuming OData services, and we really focused not on so much teaching you the SAP Ui5 basics as those specific use cases that we often run into in the HANA world. And as I said, the purpose of the videos wasn't to teach you everything about SAP Ui5 or be a general SAP Ui5 course or anything like that. There's lots of other materials. And on that subject of other materials, actually I've been reading a lot lately about some advancements that were made in SAP Ui5 in the last year. There was basically something called SAP or Ui5 Evolution, and I'll put links to some information that I found online for this. But one of the great resources that I found was basically from the Ui5 Con last year. There was a nice overview presentation mid-year on Ui5 Evolution. There's another slide deck that I'll link to in the show notes that gives you some of the specific things that you should change in your application. But a lot of this really comes down to being able to speed up the framework by better utilizing asynchronous nature of JavaScript. This should sound pretty familiar to those that have gone through the videos that covered Node.js, where a lot of the power of Node.js comes from its asynchronous nature. You see the same thing happening on the client side as well, and SAP Ui5 is really embracing that. So it means adjusting our coding, being better about how we declare libraries and UI elements when we want to use them dynamically in our code, using asynchronous callbacks for the loading of those libraries so that everything is loaded asynchronously, trying not to block the loading flow and the processing flow within the browser, as so many of the legacy libraries did. Also, you see a modularization of SAP Ui5, changing the way that the bootloader works, and getting rid of some of the legacy APIs, a lot of the jQuery.sap stuff where we extended jQuery was just becoming pretty overloaded there, and there are better APIs available in many cases now. I won't, and once again, I'm not attempting to present the entire topic to you here. I'm going to refer you to other people's material for that. But what I've done is I've gone through my examples that I showed you in the previous videos, and I've recently updated them to take some of these best practices that I found as part of this Ui5 Evolution project and brought them into my application. And what I would like to do is I want to take a look at this side by side, actually. So utilizing, if I could get my windows to snap. So I'm utilizing one of the features in the Web IDE for SAP HANA that's relatively new, which is the ability to have multiple workspaces. So from the Workspace Manager, you can create multiple workspaces. And I've just created this workspace called Old, and then my default workspace. And what I've done is I've cloned the same project in here, but two different branches of the same project. And this allows us to work in two different browser instances with, as I said, the same project but two different branches. So I've got my my original project, the master branch, which I don't want to change anymore now that the videos have started and the OpenSAP course is running. I don't want to change anything on anybody midstream. But then I've created a different branch where I've been updating, preparing for SPSO4, but also I've been applying a lot of this Ui5 Evolution Concepts. Now, I should note that the Ui5 Evolution Concepts, read the documentation as to when certain features came in, but many of it came in 1.5, 1.50, the 1.50 version of SAP UI5, the 1.56 version of SAP UI5. So even if you're doing HANA 2.0 SPS 03, then you have the 1.56 version of SAP UI5. So really, all these capabilities are available there. My system over here that I'm doing this next release prep on, I actually have 1.60 available. Of course, you can always point to the public CDN version of SAP UI5 rather than the local XSA service broker version, and always get the latest, like 1.61 version is available out there in the public. I do have this slightly newer version on my system that is planned to come with HANA 2.0 SPS 4. Due out in a couple months. I'm testing an early version here, but that's not required for most of these evolution changes. I could have made them on the older release, certainly. So don't be confused by that if you see my Bootstrap version is maybe slightly different. But what I'd like to do is show you some of the changes that I made. I want to go over here. This is my old version over here, and let's go with a very simple exercise, this multiply exercise. And I'll pull up the same here on this side. And let me just go ahead and run it here, remind you what it looked like. This is going to load. So let's load the multiply. And this was a very simple example. Here we're taking one value, two values, and we're calling a RESTful service, actually in XSJS on the server side. That doesn't matter so much. Multiplying the two values together and then putting them back into the screen. We're not really going to change anything with the way that we interact with the OData service, but I want to show you the changes I made to the bootstrapping and the manifest and things like that to be compliant with this the concepts of UI5 evolution. So one of the first major changes that you'll see here, if I bring up the index HTML, it has to do with the bootstrapping itself. And if you see here in the old environment, what I was doing is I was doing the preload async already. That's one of the major differences that we see with UI5 evolution. We want to do everything as asynchronous as possible. This is saying any libraries that we want to preload, we want to do that asynchronously. That's good. I was already utilizing that one capability. Now the other thing that you see here is I use the data SAP UI libs to tell it which libraries to preload. I've actually removed that in the newest version because I'm going to use the manifest to tell it which libraries to preload. You see a lot of the configuration of the application is really being moved into the manifest, basically for better maintainability, more robust definition, and get out of all this just the JavaScript variables setting that we're doing here in the Bootstrap. And the next change that you're going to notice is here I had to bootstrap, then I had to load a JavaScript library that had my reusable function that I was using to basically do my startup, where I was initializing my component and loading my app into my component. And I put it in an external library because I use it over and over again. Shared it between multiple applications. That's fine. I still want to do that. Now I don't have to call an extra script or load this library. What I did here is I just took my common folder where we see that, and I added it here as a resource root. So I named it common. So when I reference common, it goes to the folder common // common. So it's going to take me out of my project folder and into the resources root. And I'm using this newish feature here to SAP UI on init. You know, in the old environment here, if I look at my startup.js, if I come here to common and I look at my startup.js, what am I doing here in this local shell startup? I'm having to say SAP UI core attach init. So when we initialize, when the Bootstrap initializes, this is the code I want to run. In this environment, I don't need to attach to init. I can basically tell the Bootstrap already that I want to run a certain function on init. And I'm able to say module common, it's going to use that resource root, and then it's going to go to an index.js inside my common folder. So really I've moved this startup.js into index.js. I've kept the old one there for backwards compatibility, although I could probably clean it up now. I've converted all my apps. And what we see inside here is a lot of the same logic, but this is one of the very first changes here is my core. I'm going to require it up front, and you're going to see this in multiple places. Instead of loading the libraries dynamically or just referring to them without preloading them, I'm going to require them in advance in the startup here. I'm going to require that I'm going to have the core library and I'm going to have the component library. And what will happen is the framework will preload those now and initialize them. So when I come into my processing, I already have SAP UI core initialized, and I've got the component initialized as well. And what I'm able to do, I've got my same little utilities here to go get session info, so I can get the username and from the server and put that in JSON. That's not really changed. But what you see here is the component create. What I had before was I'm just saying new SAP UI core component container, and what that was forcing it to do was load that library synchronously at the point that I was using it, and that could stall your processing. What you see here for the component container is that I'm going to require it now. I'm going to use the SAP UI require API to require the component, and you see I'm coming into a callback function because now that's going to be loaded asynchronously. It's not going to stop my processing, and upon inside this callback function, this is where I'm actually going to create an instance of the component container. The same thing here with the component itself that I was loading down here. I get the component. The require actually comes in at this point, so it's already loaded. I don't have to worry about asynchronously dealing with that, but I can create an instance of the component. I'm going to load the manifest here, and I'm going to create the component asynchronously as well. So once again, this one has a promise on it, so when it is fulfilled, and I don't have to have an inline callback, it's kind of nice. I have a promise that will be fulfilled when it's loaded asynchronously, and that will actually take me into the rest of my processing. So like I said, these things that we learned about the asynchronous nature of Node.js, we see us applying the same concepts, the same techniques, promises, inline callbacks in some instances, for now loading asynchronously, and it's also important on the client side. On the server side, we use it to keep from blocking the event processing. It allows us to do parallel processing, parallel request in the Node.js server. On the client side, we're no longer locking the rendering of the processing of JavaScript. We can do more things in parallel, and particularly the load time, the initial load time of our application is greatly reduced by following these approaches. And we see the same thing here. Once I want to get the unified shell, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use the core load library to load it asynchronously. And I'm going to get a promise so that once it's loaded, then I can go on with processing the shell. It's just more of the same. Don't directly access the libraries with the new command without having first declared or load them. Do the processing asynchronously. Have a callback that once the unified library is loaded, then we can create a new instance of the shell inside of it, and then we can begin utilizing it. So we see our major change to the startup, but we're still initializing a component and a component container, and loading most of our information via the manifest, which we were doing before. But now we're taking much better advantage of the asynchronous nature there. If we now look at let's look at the component.js first. I made a few changes here as well, and what you see in my original component I was already using the SAP UI define and loading the component, the UI component into the function. So already what I showed you before was using some of these concepts. But what you see here is I was also pre-loading the message box and the message toast, because later in my applications I was going to use those. I was using the old jQuery SAP Require API. We don't want to use jQuery SAP Require anymore. And also, I decided, I could have just changed the API and loaded the message box and message toast here, but I decided to lazy load them later upon demand because I don't always need them. I don't always have messages popping up. So rather than load these JavaScript libraries now on initialization of my component, I decided to defer them to later when I actually need them. We'll see that code later. So now you'll see it later in my component in my controller. So I just removed that altogether. The rest of the component JS is the same, basically a basic framework component JS, because most of the work is being done here in the manifest. Now let's compare the manifest of the two versions of the application. So essentially here, I haven't changed a whole lot. The SAP Ui5 version, yes, I did up the version numbers to the 1.6 version, independent of the Ui5 evolution stuff that I was doing, because I'm also migrating the application to a new version of SAP Ui5. As I said, that's kind of independent. I narrowed my supported themes. I really only want the new Belize theme. I'm just cleaning up some stuff in my manifest that maybe I should have done before. The big difference here is my root view is now when I load the root view, there's a new option here for async on it as well. So I'm going to load my my views asynchronously. Better performance, once again, just applying those same concepts there. This is an easy one to change since it's just a parameter that you need to add on the specification of your root view. And because we're doing this in manifest, the actual code generation to load the view, we'll use an asynchronous with a callback and things like that. If we were to load a view dynamically in code, which I'm not really doing in any of my examples, there are some in the online materials I'll point to. You would need to have a callback and things like that. The manifest or loading a view as a fragment inside of another view, the framework's going to take care of that for us. Not really any other changes here on the making sure that it's async. It's really only the root view and the change of the versions, which, as I said, doesn't directly impact what I'm doing for Ui5 Evolution. On the view XML, not a whole lot of changes here. A couple things that I did clean up that I probably should have just done a better job before. I was using the core library for my view, and really should use the core MVC library. So you see I've cleaned that up in the newer version. Otherwise, the only other thing that I did here is you'll notice I added more IDs. Although in this particular example, you'll see that in some of the other examples I'll show you here. To support extensibility, Fiori extensibility, you want to make sure that you have IDs on any of your UI elements that you might want to allow personalization or adaptation of. And in some of my views, I had not done that. I did not always have an ID for the visible UI elements, so I went through many examples and I did add those. That's also something of note with Ui5 Evolution. They recommend that. Okay. The controller is probably where we're going to see more interesting changes. So if I come here to my controller, before I was loading, I was already using the SAP UI define in the overall structure of the controller, so I was pretty good there. What you're going to see, let me see if I've got some examples here. I didn't have to make a whole lot of changes in this one, so I might have to switch to some others. Oh, here's a good example. Yes, I was using the old jQuery SAP Require. Like I said, in this case, I'm loading the number format. But what I wanted to do here, you need to switch the jQuery SAP require to the new SAP UI require. And we're going to use a similar format that we use here when in the controller or the component when we're loading. We want to do them asynchronously, so I'm going to require. I say the library that I want to require. Notice instead of dots, we use the forward slashes. But we're going to get a number format option, but it's going to be loaded asynchronously. So we need to put this in a callback statement. So we're not going to block our code in this case, but it means any subsequent code that uses the number formatter does need to go in the callback handler. So I had to move that up inside the event handler. But now I get an instance of the number format, and I can use the get integer instance and use that number formatter. So it's mainly loading the library of the number formatter. I don't want to use the old jQuery SAP require or the synchronous way. I want to use SAP UI require and the asynchronous API. It's the same thing down here with the error messages. The message box, before I was declaring that using SAP UI, using jQuery, the jQuery SAP require, and I was doing it in my component controller way up front. Now I've decided we're going to lazy load it. We're going to wait to the point that I actually need it when an error occurs. Maybe an error never occurs in my application, then I don't need to load that, that particular library. But we're going to use the same SAP UI require to load it. And this is going to be asynchronous as well. We'll get an instance of the message box passed in, but only into the event callback handler. So I had to move all my logic into the callback handler of loading the message box. But then the rest of the code is the same. You know, I'm using an instance here of message box from SAP M message box. Here I was going from the whole library. But logically, it all works the same way, just now much more asynchronous in nature. Okay, so that was a simple example. Let's look at a slightly more robust example, maybe OData Basic here. Not a whole lot of changes compared to our multiply example. I'm not going to point out everything that's the same. Come here and look at OData Basic. I'm using the same bootstrap loader here. The other thing that I've done is actually, as I was going through here, I had the same basic error block or a few basic error blocks all throughout my examples. So I actually took this error.js and I moved it up here in common as well, put it in a separate file. But I've got different error call handlers, one for if you're making an asynchronous JavaScript call, so like if you're calling an XSJS service. I've got an OData error, and I've got just a very generic OData metadata error catcher. So these can be used, these can be attached to different events. I'll show you in a minute how I do that. But you can see I've rewritten all of these to also use the SAP UI require. In this case, I needed both core and message box. You can lazy load multiple libraries at the same time. As you see here in this example, all the other two I've just used the message box as you saw. And to get this library in, of reusable functions available in my application, I'm just going to load it here in the index.html. Then in my controller, those functions are all going to be available. If we look here, my component.js, nothing's really different about my component.js. My manifest, let's look at the manifest. Yeah, the only change to the manifest that is in addition here, of course, I am doing the asynchronous loading of the root view, but the other thing that I changed, and I actually had it in the old example as well, but I'll point it out to you, is when we're loading the model object, there's also a preload option here as well that will allow the metadata and the model to be created asynchronously by telling in the manifest to preload. So using similar concepts, we get better performance if we preload the model as well. So I've utilized that option. Otherwise, this is all the same. I don't think my view is drastically different compared to the changes we've already seen. I think I've shown you most of the changes. We'll notice, okay, page, here I've done a better job. I'm adding IDs to everything. So any place I didn't have an ID, I added it. I also added the title level on my on my page. That came from the suggestions as well for Fury adaptability. So I've just cleaned up a few things like that. If we look at my controller, I think this is the last controller we want to look at. Most of the changes are just getting rather redundant at this point, but you'll see on the like here I'm loading the metadata, or I'm calling my OData service dynamically. Actually, in this example I don't, but when I load the metadata, if it fails, I'm calling the OData failed rather than inlining the message. That's just coming from that reusable function in my common error.js. I really don't think there's too many other adjustments that I want to show you here. What you'll see if you look through the controllers, that's the only other place. I mean, obviously the asynchronous nature of loading some of the UI5 libraries, but most of those are the SAP UI require. You're going to see that all over the place. I've already shown you a basic example of that. So it's really just applying those concepts that I've already talked about to all the different examples. So if you are interested, maybe you went through the previous exercises, you're feeling pretty comfortable with SAP UI5, you want to up your game, take advantage of the latest features of Ui5 Evolution and the asynchronous loading, the new APIs, then maybe have a look at this other branch in the project. You're welcome to look through all the different Ui5 exercises. I have updated them all to use these new concepts. Look through them, and hopefully you learn from them as well. Like I said, I don't claim to be the latest and greatest expert on SAP UI5. I'm going to link to some of the other resources that are available here on the topic, but the exercises that I've created, focused in their nature, I have tried to pull in as much as I can some of these best practices that I've learned recently about usage of SAP UI5 as well.